Well, thank you, everyone. National Geographic devoted their entire April 2019 issue, this month's issue, to the idea of cities. And in this month's issue, they cover all kinds of topics, stories around these ideas of cities, things like how we define cities and how we will define cities in the future, how we live with rats in all of our cities. And of course, we picked one city, a mega city, that we could feature. And that city, of course, was Tokyo. The reason that we picked Tokyo is because it is many, many things. It is the biggest, the most populous, arguably the safest, the cleanest, one of the most dynamic, one of the most innovative and complex cities in the world. And for Neil and I, it proved also to be one of the most fun and also one of the most confounding and fascinating places that we have ever worked.
This isn't usually the kind of story that David and I do. We end up in very hot places, very cold places. We sleep on the ground a lot. There's bugs usually. But so first thing we had to do was try to figure out how to discuss the biggest city on the planet. And I found a little bit of comfort in a Harvard economist named Edward Glaser, who calls cities humanity's greatest inventions. And so I thought, okay, there's something I can work with. And Tokyo is, if it is the superlative city, as David just described, that must mean that it's also possibly our greatest invention. And so I started to think about this, and it is perhaps our greatest invention. It's an incubator, it's a nursery. There's so much creative conflict happening within the city itself. And it's this friction combined with this density that makes it great. Tokyo, if you don't think about it every day, it's already there in your life. It's there in your sushi, in your ramen. It's there in your kids' video games, or if you're like me, the video games you still play. It's there in the cell phone camera that you use all the time. And just this morning I went out and it was like, okay, I'm gonna get in the Tokyo mindset. I'm not gonna have coffee. I'm gonna have a matcha, right? We have matcha. All of this stuff comes to us. All of this is distilled Japanese culture that comes to us through the gateway of Tokyo. It's this incredible place, 37 million people, 3,000 miles of train lines, 10 million commuters squeezing through it and under it and over it every day.
And so these are all the great reasons why we picked Tokyo to feature Tokyo, but we were also kind of wondering at the beginning, why us? Why Neil and I?
Well, the reason, as I said, we don't usually do this kind of story, so what's the first reason to pick the two of us to do this? It turns out that we both have a history with Japan and with Tokyo. I realized that growing up in the 70s and 80s, I was constantly surrounded by Japanese culture. It was there in the cartoons that I watched, in the toys that I played with, in the way that I was constantly sort of using these words like sayonara, which I did not realize at the time came from Japanese culture. And so, flash forward to college, I suddenly am thrown together in that wonderful melting pot with a Japanese roommate who came from Tokyo. And he started to tell me about the culture, so I took a Japanese language class sort of on a whim, but I really wanted to go to Africa, but I couldn't afford to. So I applied to this program where if you got in, the Japanese government would pay for you to go to Japan. So I end up living in Japan for a year. I get dropped into a northern city called Sapporo, where the beer comes from, if you're at a sushi restaurant. And I'm suddenly having to learn the language and eat the food and do all these things that were completely foreign, except the giant robots and some of the language and the video games, those were still very familiar to me. So coming back after 20 years is definitely a homecoming.
And I also lived in Japan, and I lived in Japan for nearly 9 years with my family, up until coming back to the United States after living abroad for 20 years. And I loved Japan as much as Neil. But I intended to photograph it and show everything that I loved and admired about the Japanese. But I didn't really get to do that, to be honest, because I was a news photographer. And the whole experience for me and my family was disrupted in 2011 when we experienced a triple disaster, one of the biggest earthquakes in Japanese history, followed by a once-in-a-millennia tsunami that wiped out the entire coastline, killing over 150,000 people. And then, as if that wasn't bad enough, the nuclear power plant in Fukushima was inundated, melted down, and exploded. So my family got on a plane and came back to the United States. And I did what we always do. I went to the epicenter of this disaster. National Geographic called me and said, "We'd like you to go inside the nuclear exclusion zone and show us what's happening. Do you know how to do that?" I said, "Of course I know how to do that." I had no idea how to do that. But I found my way inside, and for about 2 months, wearing a hazmat suit and a Geiger counter, I slept in abandoned schools, in my car, in abandoned houses, and I tried to tell this story of this now empty and invisible radioactive poisoned place, and tried to tell the story of what happened to all of these people. And I didn't get to tell the beautiful, wonderful things about Tokyo as a photographer because I was busy doing this, but what I learned when I was photographing this story for National Geographic was the admiration I had for the way that people responded to this disaster, how they stuck together. A lot of the world was surprised to see no looting, no crime, everybody banding together to survive this catastrophe. But I wasn't surprised at all. And that's the thing that I wanted to do, not only when I came back to Tokyo this time for National Geographic, not only to tell these positive, wonderful stories about Japan and how much I love Tokyo, but to try and show that the reason that Tokyo works and the reason that the Japanese people can all live together in this small place is because of their resilience and because of their civility.
Resilience would become this incredible quality or this incredible ingredient that we would discover again and again as we walked across the city. And it's really one of the things that gives Tokyo its power. Through its people, the city gathers this power. So I want you to stop for a second and think about your favorite city. It might not be DC. It's okay if it's not. Think about a city that you've loved, the one that you fell in love in, the one that you grew up in, the one that you've always wanted to visit. Cities are these dynamic places that attract us. What did it take, do you think, to build that city that you love? Think about the architects and the laborers and the firemen and women and the policemen and women and all of the services that go into that, and imagine that sort of X-ray vision of a city with the pipes and the tubes and the internet and the electricity and all of it coming in to make this inhabitable urban space. Everything that you love and everything that you hate about a city, its neighborhoods, its traffic. If you're like me, you come from New York, you're angry all the time, kind of because of the subway. In DC, I know that it's the same now, so we share this hatred. All of this energy is concentrated in these cities, and what I did not realize until I returned was that my youth with Japanese anime and cartoons had been teaching me something. Because in almost every cartoon I ever watched or comic book I read, Tokyo gets destroyed. It's like you can read these things and it's like Neo Tokyo 1, Neo Tokyo 2, Godzilla does it, Mothra, everybody gets in on Tokyo. But this comes from a place of reality because no other city has had to invent itself more completely than Tokyo in the last 100 years. This is a picture from 1923 after the Great Kanto earthquake, which happened off the coast of Japan and then flattened the cities of Yokohama and Tokyo. In Tokyo, this is Tokyo, at least 140,000 people died, 44,000 of them in a firestorm that swept through the city and burned the wooden structures to the ground. Later in 1945, after the bombing, the Allied bombing of the city, the Japanese also faced with this kind of existential destruction. So they've had a chance to build up from the ground twice in 100 years. I shouldn't say a chance, actually. They've been forced to rebuild from the ground up. So all of those things that we took a moment to imagine, they've had to do that twice. And they've had the opportunity to take a look at the city and make other choices each time.
So when a photographer like me begins a story like this, I always begin looking at it from the top, looking at it from above. And you can see what Neil is talking about, a city that grew up very quickly out of the ashes. It almost looks like it just sprung chaotically in all directions, like it just sprouted up out of the ground. So this is how I start telling a story. Stand above, try to pick my route, try to imagine like what it is that I'm going to confront. But the only way to really ultimately tell this story is not to stand above and look down on the city, but it is to descend down into Tokyo and to start meeting the people, wandering the streets, getting lost, really just walking the streets.
And if we were thinking of a city as an invention, when we think of an invention, usually, at least for me, it's something like clockwork, which isn't a bad idea for a city. It's this intricate thing with all these ticking pieces that somehow manage to move together and do the thing, whatever the thing is. So we chose to walk because this was the way to get down into the spaces where people lived, onto the stage where their lives played out. It really got us close to that idea of the color and the life and the power of humanity and where it happens in this city. We chose, how are we have to put a frame around this because it's so big. So are we going to walk across the greater metropolitan area, which you can see is enormous. It's probably too much for, 2 pairs of feet. So we picked the smaller historic city center, which if you look at the start and finish, that's about 60 miles across if we were just to put our heads down and bolt through it.
But, of course, that's 60 miles if you walk directly from A to B, but journalists don't walk like that. We don't move like that. We both carried a GPS tracker. This shows my footsteps. Each color is a different day. And as you can see, we don't walk in a straight line. We walk like totally insane people, zigzagging, backtracking, wandering around, completely getting lost. And so I have to be honest, we lost track by the end of how many miles we walked. But I know within the first 3 weeks that I had personally walked over 250 miles. And that's not the easiest way to get through a city, and it's certainly not the way that most people from Tokyo get through the city. They spend most of their life commuting underground. But it proved to be the most interesting and effective way. And so that means turning a corner and having these little serendipitous moments and just simply being nimble and being mobile. And so that also informed the way that I told the story and the tools that I used. I'm a mobile phone photographer. My principal camera, really, even for National Geographic over the last few years, has become my mobile phone. And this was the perfect tool for this kind of job. We were on the move. So when I turn the corner and have this little moment and I find this old sort of photo op poster where you stick your face through the hole, this geisha, and through the hole you can see this modern convenience store. My camera's in my back pocket or in my hand. I like photographing with a mobile phone, not only because I didn't have to carry big, heavy equipment as I walked for hundreds of miles, but also it's always with me, it's always in my hand, it's light, it's discreet, it's less intimidating. When I pick up my big, fancy, professional Nat Geo camera, people tend to, it creates a distance between me and people. It can. In Japan especially, everybody has a mobile phone in their hand, and so everybody's doing it. And so it has a way of allowing for a more intimate kind of photo. And also, for me, as a photographer, I tend to kind of rush past all of these photographs, looking for something more newsworthy or more dramatic. My mobile phone made me sort of stop and make these little contemplative pictures. Pictures like the tentacles of an octopus in a market, or this node of light underneath a train bridge. These photos are not really perfect photos at all, but what they are little pieces of a puzzle. And when I start to put together these pieces of a puzzle, they begin to reveal something about Tokyo that's greater than the sum of its parts.
And I've been lucky to work with David on this story and been inspired by his use of mobile phone photography previously, because I started to do that too. And often I'd find myself like, Dave's taking a picture and I'm kind of behind him trying to get the picture too, less good, but using him as cover. But it does become a different way of doing journalism too, because you're getting a small image and then you can write a small story. And that's actually been the way it has helped me to shape the stories that I write, these moments that become part of a larger story. But here we see a grid of many Japanese things happening. And what I started to realize as I was looking at this, as I was taking pictures and writing in my notebook, is that we were walking through the middle of all these stories that were happening all around us. And I sort of had this mind-blowing moment where I'm like, this is quantum reality, man. This is multiple universes. We're transiting through all of these stories that are already happening. We're passing along the edges and through the middles of these universes that are all happening throughout the city. So here you have some classic Japanese images. You have the koi, symbol of Japan and China too. You have the Japanese traditional sandals. You have peaches neatly arranged in a traditional garden setting. And then you have whatever's happening up there in the corner, right? So very quickly, we'll come back to this, but this is a festival in a blue-collar neighborhood of Japan. And what's happening here is somebody's reaching up to hold on to a guy to keep him from falling off a sawhorse as he shouts directions to his team. He's actually wearing clothing. He's wearing a traditional Japanese piece of underwear called a fundoshi. And let's just remember that the word fun is in there. So we'll come back to this. But one of the ways that we had to start breaking down the city, we're seeing all these stories, we're walking across it, but we still do have to give it shape. How do we get into this greatest invention and begin to peel back these layers? Well, if Tokyo is a superlative story, then you start with the superlatives. You start with the biggest and the greatest and the most. And one of the easy places for us to think about that was, how do you feed 37 million people? Where do you go to find out what that looks like? And for us, we ended up at a place called Tsukiji Market.
This place is absolutely mind-blowing. This little market is the world's biggest. By biggest, it means there's something like 1,600 tons of sea creatures, fish, plants, things that I ate and I had no idea what they actually were, that all passes through this little market every single morning and feeds the entire city of Tokyo practically. And the most interesting, or the centerpiece of this entire market, is the tuna auction. It's made quite famous now because not only do they, before dawn, line up thousands of bluefish tuna on the floor to sell them, but some of these fish have been sold, one tuna sold for record prices of over 330 million yen, which is over $3 million.
So one of the crazy things about Tsukiji is it's like this gothic horror show if you're a fish. Like this is hell if you're a fish. And we found, for me it was like a cross between a construction site and like a carnival fun house. And David and I the first day that we went there, we had to show up at something like 3:30, 4:30 in the morning to get access to this area. And as we're going in, just after the sun begins to peak above the horizon, we're wearing these weird vests to make sure we don't get run over. And there's like a trail of fish eyeballs on the sidewalk leading into this thing. And it was this, and great, as we're walking into these gigantic warehouses where all of this processing happens, we're hearing saw blades. The scream of saw blades, which are cutting through the fish bodies. We're hearing the sound of axes chopping something, who knows what. And this one point where we walk toward the tuna auction, I feel myself lightly misted with something, and I think it's water, but it turns out that we're walking past a saw that's furiously carving up some kind of fish. So we're suddenly glistening with scales, we're glistening with frozen fish flesh, and it's one of the few places where you can actually get under the surface and see about Tokyo's appetites. This is what it actually requires to feed 37 million people's appetite for sushi. These are the small fish carts that you have to avoid as you're going through the market. I think this particular guy almost ran me over 5 times. It's essentially a propane tank with wheels, which is a great idea. And they're very fast, and they're just going all over the place like a swarm of angry bees. And this was something that we had to stay out of the way of. And it brought us back to, it brings us back to this idea of what does it take to keep a city like this going? Mm-hmm. If you're feeding it, you're housing it, you're watering it, you're giving it internet, you're making the phones work. This was a place for us to begin and sort of begin to peel back those layers.
It's become so popular at Tsukiji. There's literally hundreds of tourists who come there to see this from all over the world, that I didn't think that we were actually even going to be allowed to go there and work, because there's just too too much interest in this absolutely wonderful, amazing place. So we had to go and ask for a special access. They said at the beginning, no, we're not going to be able to accommodate you. And then I came up with the idea that I would go meet one of the little small fish brokerages and see if they would allow me, like sort of talk me through the front door, the back door. And I met the CEO of the small brokerage. He was in his 80s. He had a cane. He invited me into his office. We had tea. I told him what we wanted to do, and he listened patiently. And then he said in perfect English, just a moment, I need to go get something out of my closet. And he came back with a copy of National Geographic magazine from 1982, when Skiji was the cover story of the magazine, and photographed by a photographer named Jim Stanfield, an elder, famous elder of mine. And he said, I've heard you. I'm going to let you come and photograph here, because the last man that National Geographic sent here was a man of honor. So the place has a lot of history, and now it's gone. So we were not only going there because we wanted to show how the city is fed, but I knew that this was going to be the last chance. This place is wonderful, fascinating, but it's also not very modern, not very state-of-the-art, not refrigerated, not particularly sanitary. And so, again, Tokyo has to rebuild, and they've moved this fish market to another part of the city. That move was very controversial, but probably necessary, but it was also quite sad for men and women who have worked there for now 3 generations.
When we think about Tokyo, we often think about how crowded it must be or how expensive it must be. These are things that are very obvious just looking at almost any picture of the city. The Japanese have to use space creatively. They have to figure out how to crowd all of these people into the city. And that takes on amazing forms. Well, their solutions are incredible. But imagine for a second that you have you are Japanese, your country has just been reduced to a flat sort of wasteland. You need to rebuild very quickly, you need to rehouse all of these people, and you have to restart the economy. So what Japan did after the war, fairly soon after the war, was start to build these very large public housing complexes where they have these sort of Stalin-esque looking buildings that housed thousands of people and became sort of miniature cities throughout the city unto themselves. We went to one called Takashima-dera on the sort of the northwestern edge of the city. And this is a danchi. I keep using the word danchi. That sort of means public condominium. It's like a public housing project. And Takashima-dera was finished in 1972. And at its height, a couple of years later, 30,000 people were living here in 29 buildings, each one of them 14 stories tall. Some of the apartments were a little bigger than others, but mostly they were very small family apartments. And as I'm walking through here, I just have to say, as the father of a 1-year-old, I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, no way, no way. This is dangerous public playground equipment, but also awesome. This is essentially a miniature Mount Fuji, right? And so the kids climb up this side and you see this child here and they just kind of spin down and somehow nobody ever catches their face on the rungs or a leg, you know, all the things that parents worry about these days. So I went into this place, and David went into this place, and we were talking to the people, we're getting to know them. It's very dense, but these danchis have also become symbols of the way that Japan is changing. And from that high of 30,000 people living in this particular settlement, something like 15 or 16,000 do now. There's a lot of empty space. There's a lot of abandoned apartments. It started to say something new about Tokyo. This huge housing project with lots of little units where people have to cram their lives in are meaning something different. Japan has to figure out how to deal with all of this empty space now. One day as I was walking through the courtyard of the danchi here, I met up with a very small old man named Shoji Sakamoto. He was 85 years old, and he had lived in Takashima-dera since the start, since about in the 70s. He and his wife had moved in there at the start, and he told me that when he came, everyone was a young couple with a child or two. And he had lived there long enough to watch that absolutely change. More than half of the people who live there now are over 65. And Mr. Sakamoto, he was dragging a cart along beside him filled with vegetables. His wife had become ill and she was in a wheelchair, and their house was too small for both of them and the wheelchair. So he had to rent an apartment on the other side of the complex for his wife to live there. And every day he would buy vegetables and meat and go over to make his wife dinner. And he was describing how very hard this was in compelling ways. But one of the things he said, I think it will touch all of us in a certain way. Every night I ask my wife what she wants for dinner. And every night she says, whatever. And then it's sort of his very small body got a little smaller, and he said, whatever is the hardest thing to make. And it was touching, it broke my heart, and then he just sort of walked away with his cart of vegetables and, past the little Mount Fuji thing. And it's one symbol of how Japan is changing, and we'll come back around to that soon.
Broadly, what Neil is talking about is when you have so many people and you've run out of real estate to continue to develop laterally, what do? Your only choice really is to go up. And so people live by the thousands on top of one another in very small apartments. And even on the roofs of these apartments, I found farms. This is a rice farm across this entire one of the rooftops that I visited. Little water bottles filled with little rice plants. And when you can't continue to grow upward, you have to start digging. And so Tokyo is increasingly becoming a city that's underground as well. On the left, that is one of the most amazing public works projects that I've ever seen. It's a cistern so big that it can divert the full volume of 2 rivers and flush it out into the ocean whenever they have flooding after typhoons. And on the right is what's becoming more and more typical scene in Japan, the underground, shops, restaurants, and in this case, even a little garden in front of the Tokyo subway stop where I used to jump on the train when I would go to my office.
For us, Tokyo was so much about how people live and move across this layer cake of the city. They wake up in their apartment, they go down, then they go underground, then they come back up, then they go up into their office. So they're constantly ascending and descending and moving through the layer cake of the urban experience. One of the amazing things about this is how do they even make it possible? I know that New York could not do this, okay? Having lived there for long enough to know that it would explode from the chaos. Japan manages chaos very well. And one of the things they do is that the transportation system is kind of a miracle. As I said a little bit earlier, there's 3,000 miles of train track here, almost 300 stations on the network, which is fewer than New York City. But then if you think about how many people squeeze through this, it's 10 million people every day sort of get compressed and regurgitated into the city. That's more than the entire population of New York City. And it is a transportation miracle.
This is what the miracle looks like up close and personal. This is the Marunouchi line at Shinjuku Station, which is the busiest in Tokyo, which automatically makes it the busiest on the planet, for sure. And here I was, like squeezing in, trying to make photographs of this like school of fish just moving through. Literally millions of people move through this station. They squeeze into the train. The trains arrive on time exactly to the second, every 3 minutes. They have guys in white gloves that try to pry the doors open just so that last person can get their shoe that they slipped off, or pull their handbag back into the train before it takes off again. The trains are so efficient that if a train is late enough, by minutes, I mean, when you leave the turnstile of the train station, they'll hand you a note that you can give to your boss as an excuse of why you've arrived late to work.
Did this lady lose her feet?
She did not lose her shoes. I saw, they have a lost and found at this train station, and they keep everything because they're very efficient, but there's one room that's only umbrellas, and there must be 100,000 umbrellas in there. So the train network there is truly a miracle. I I sometimes felt like if I turned and went the wrong way, I'd just set this ripple effect, and I would like bring down the entire transit system to a screeching halt. But the reason that it works is not just because it's so efficient. The reason that it works is because Japanese people know how to work together, and they know how to move together. And this kind of efficiency can only work through cooperation and through patience and through humility. And that is the reason why Tokyo works. And this is a kind of humility that I've only ever seen in a city like Tokyo.
And as you squeeze yourself through the bowels of Tokyo, you have to come out at some point, although you could live there. Some people do, for a little while anyway. You emerge into the sunlight, and if you're like us, you go straight for a vending machine where we survived on a drink called Pocari Sweat. Has anyone heard about this? Your first question might be like, what is a Pocari, and what does its sweat taste like? I've never answered this question, but it's awesome. It's sort of like Japanese Gatorade. So we would feed at these things, and you'd see like the two, Americans over there hiding in the bushes. But you emerge into, I found that whenever I went underground and then emerged back into the city, it was like this cleansing of the palate, where we'd find something new and we'd be ready to discover whatever was apparent in that place. And in so many places, nature was present. Nature is sort of a crucial part of the Japanese aesthetic, of Japanese arts and literature. But you also remember that we're on an island in the Pacific. And if you're a plant, this is a good place to be. I think this is actually kudzu, which if you're from the southern United States, you know what that is and what it does. And the kudzu is like, I like Pocari Sweat as well. So it starts to, in some places, it reclaims entire neighborhoods. We talked about those abandoned buildings or abandoned apartments. Some neighborhoods are like this, and the kudzu is moving in. But as you get squeezed through these places, you come into the enormous open spaces of Japan, where not only is it fresh air and sunlight and culture, but some of the stranger experiences start to happen.
Yeah, I was always interested in how, in a place that's pretty much all concrete, cement, urban, how the Japanese were able to preserve and protect and share these very precious green spaces, and how they can still manage to have contact with nature in their public parks. This is a park that was across the street from my apartment when I lived there with my family. It's become kind of like every park in the city sort of has its own character, and this park, Setagaya Koen, has become kind of the family park. And I was just always so amazed at the intentional engagement that people had with these little precious pockets of nature and quiet. And these are families, we'd come together. I mean, in what city in the center of the city can you build an open bonfire with your children? And then they would take this bread dough with chestnuts and wrap it, twist it around the end of these long bamboo stalks, and roast bread out in the middle of the park. This was a puppy photo club meeting that I crashed in another public park called Ueno. Yeah, the Japanese are trying to find in this super urban environment ways that they can continue to connect with nature. And that was, there's so many, the popularity of little lap dogs and pets and cats are very, very common, and people feed feral cats in front of their homes. And that was super common. And I even saw when I lived there these puppy cafes and kitty cafes where people go and they can spend 15 minutes and pay 1,000 yen to pet animals. But when I came back this time, I found that it wasn't just puppy and kitty cafes. There are now otter cafes, hedgehog cafes, and this in central Harajuku is an owl cafe. You can walk through, and if you're gentle, pet the head of an owl, many different species of owls, with the back of your hand. So I was always looking for how people could continue to sort of touch nature in such an urban place.
You can imagine that if you're a little kid and you live in a city like this, open space is really important. I know that my son in New York City is constantly, kids don't think about it the same way. They're like, broken glass, that's fun, let's play in that. And in Japan, it's a very different place. It's so clean, as David said, that you don't have to worry about things like that at all. This is a pleasant weekend at Yoyogi Park, I think it was, and there was a guy who was making big bubble apparitions, and the kids were chasing them around and through them. And for us, this photograph speaks to a couple things. One of them is that Japan actually has fewer and fewer children than almost any other country, developed country in the world. But it still has this very much youth-forward face. We think about New York City and Tokyo as two examples. It's constantly telling a story about itself that it's like where you go if you're young, and young power, and all of the cultural themes and memes that we see come out in video games, Instagram, the internet. They're very largely based on this fascination with youth culture. And this was a very Instagrammable moment for some Japanese. I think they were, what were they? They were teenagers, were they high school students? You can't quite see it, but they're all wearing like the Sailor Moon outfit. Have you all seen? They're in their white t-shirts and probably navy skirts or something, which are in itself a meme. And Tokyo is very much about these memes that creep through it and spend a lot of time hanging out in youth culture.
For a city that maybe people think of as sort of gray and big and ruthless, it's very playful. You know, Astro Boy over the subway, these kids in their traditional happy coats with a Rubik's Cube, and this guy's apartment, that's his bookshelf with all of these sort of old anime and monsters and so forth. And this is the image this youthful image that the Japanese project and that they export. This is what makes up their economy. This is in many ways the first touch point that Neil had and many of us have to Japan. You know, the cosplay, the gaming, the anime. I mean, this is what Japan sends out to the rest of the world. And there's a place called Harajuku. This is Takeshi Street. This is, I guess, ground zero for that kind of youth culture, where people, including this foreign woman who arrived, you know, in costume. This is the place where people come to play out that kind of idea that they have of Japan. And this is the most youthful part of the city. This is the most Instagrammed spot on Earth.
Can you go back for a second?
Sure.
I'm curious, but I never got to ask Dave this actually. The next one, did everybody catch what this is here? Like, did you do that?
Did I do it?
The go-kart thing?
So you can now go there. If you were a Mario Kart gamer enthusiast, you can now go and dress up like these guys and spin around central Tokyo. I never did it, but it was like this thing that was like in the background of every single day I was there. I'd just be walking along, and all of a sudden these guys would come by again. And I was lucky enough to get them. I was just randomly walking across an intersection, and they pulled up in front of me.
And you could dress up, like I saw them too, and this guy's dressed like Tigger, I think,
yeah.
And there's like a Ninja Mutant Turtle in the background, and then like a mushroom and a dragon. And whenever I show people a collection of photos from Japan, they're all like, oh, pretty, oh, neat, neat, neat. But this is the one that they're all like, I want to do that. I'm going to spend all my money right now to go there, because it's like the closest you can get to playing a video game, and it's fitting into that idea of Tokyo as a video game.
So from ground zero of youth, there's also a ground zero street for the elderly in Japan.
There's a district called Sugamo, where it's called like the elderly Harajuku, or the elderly Shinjuku. And it's a place that's dominated by businesses that cater to old people, cafes that cater to old people, experiences that are shared by elderly people. Japan has one of the most rapidly aging populations in the world. In the next few years, something like a full third of Japanese citizens are going to be over the age of 65. It's going to have to deal with this. And old people are such a part of the city that, as one anthropologist put it to me, you can't hide them. In American cities in the West, we tend to we don't talk about it like old people go away, but in Japan, they're fully a part of the community. And in this particular district, you can walk down the streets and you have shops that are catering to everything old people see. I saw people buying knee braces. I saw them buying oxygen tanks. I saw them checking out canes. I heard them extolling the virtues of certain types of end-of-life care. And then I also saw them buying bright red underwear. So in Japan, red is a symbol of good luck and longevity. And so you would have these racks and racks of bright red, fire truck red underwear. And you'd have these, like my grandmother's there, like checking out a thong, like, should I get this one? What do you think, Doris? And they're like testing the waistbands of the thongs, which was an interesting image that now I share with you. But also, there is to touch on this idea of age, there is a specific temple in this district where you go to the Arai Canon. This is a statue of Canon, and a Buddhist deity, and Arai means to wash. And what you have here is elderly people lining up to wash the statue, because it's believed that if you dip the cup and ladle the water over the part of the statue that corresponds to where you ache, and then you gently wash it away, that will take the illness with it. And the priest told me an interesting story. He said they had recently had to get a new canon because the old one had been washed so frequently that its features had been washed away.
It's a bit of a two-sided coin, aging in Japan. The Japanese are the luckiest of all of us because they live the longest. And it's very normal to see people well into their 80s or older, out living a super vibrant, energetic life. This guy with his, fire helmet out on his bike, feeding birds in Ueno Park. But the other side of that coin is that as the country ages, as Neil had described, and so much of the population are now seniors, there's a whole host of social problems that come with that, not least of which homelessness. So many people that you see on the streets of Japan who are homeless are seniors, people who lost their jobs when the bubble burst in the 80s and never ever recovered. And it's sobering to see so many people like this out in the streets. The Japanese tend to find futuristic solutions. They look to technology for solutions to their social problems. And so with so many old people in the country and so few young people, such a small labor force and few immigrants, there aren't people to take care of them. And so they've decided the best way is to bring robots into the equation. This is a retirement home. These 4 women are between the ages of 93 and 100, and they are brought to this table every day so that they can love and be loved by these robotic baby seals and robotic dogs.
And loneliness, if we didn't mention it before, is becoming one of the social problems of Japan. You began to see it in the danchi, in that big housing complex, and the idea that there were a lot of vacant apartments in these very small spaces where people their lives were corralled, and now they were sort of opening up and becoming vacant. Loneliness is becoming one of the descriptive illnesses or ailments of Japanese society. There's even a phrase for it called kodokushi. Has anyone heard this phrase? It means lonely death. And it seems to be increasingly a problem in Japan, where people may pass away and they're not close to their family, they don't have family anymore, so nobody finds them for a while. And this is an interesting problem. I spoke with the governor of Tokyo, and she said that it was one of the top items on her agenda was to figure out how to deal with loneliness in such a big city where you wouldn't think of loneliness as a problem. But quickly, the robots seem to people respond to them very well, actually, and they find that there's this brief period of weirdness, because it's a robot after all, but then people actually start to respond to the robot very well, except in some cases. I was walking through that neighborhood, Sugamo, and there was an older man with his very elderly mother standing beside him with her arm inside his. She's this elegant older lady with a big sun hat, and she was carrying an umbrella. And they were gazing into the shop front here. And the son says to her, "Can we get a robot to take care of you yet?" And the lady gives him an elbow. And she says, "No. They're too scary. You're stuck with me." So this is something the Japanese are trying out, but it's not all the way there yet. We're not going to be replaced by robots yet. As we moved through the city, one of the things that we had to do was obviously sleep. Some days we didn't, it seems like. We just kept walking and walking. But even going in to find a place to stay for the night became part of our Tokyo experience. Because throughout the city, there are so many different neighborhoods. Each one has a different character. Each one includes different ways to stay. Or to live, really. So we tried to do as much of this as we can. For practical reasons, we kind of just ended up at hotels because we just needed to fall on the bed for a couple of hours and then get back up and keep walking. My editor's here, she made me do this. Cracking the whip on us. But so this is in a neighborhood called Yanaka, I believe it was. It's sort of like an old temple town. It's been absorbed by Tokyo, but I stayed in a tatami room, which was an old college student's dorm room. And this is what they used to look like. It's just a flat floor with reed mats, and you roll out your futon every night. And instead of windows, they have these sliding screen doors. Some of them are paper, some of them are glass. And you can see this like nice writing scene where I get to look out the window and watch Japanese life pass by. The other scene in the center here is a capsule hotel, which you've probably heard about. Maybe didn't believe was real. Has anybody stayed in one? There are these, basically like you have, so like a human-sized pod, and you see that there are a dozen of them here on this floor. You crawl into your human-sized pod each night, and you draw the curtain and you sleep, like bee larva or a mummy or something. And it's a really fascinating use of space, but I'm not gonna do it again because you can hear everything that happens in every other pod.
And on the right is one of the rooms I slept in that I liked, which was not much bigger than the bed itself, but when I would lie down and put my head on the pillow, I looked up at this wild anime painting and this kind of heaven up on the ceiling.
As we're moving through these stories, as we're moving through these neighborhoods, we keep coming into contact with the ways that history, despite the fact that it had been sort of erased physically twice, it keeps coming back to the surface, and these traditional items, and these traditional ideas, and these traditional aesthetics survived, and they keep influencing culture. In this way, even though so much was erased by war and earthquake, Tokyoites are kind of living astride time. They're constantly in conversation with the past in a way that we're not here in the United States particularly. They're constantly speaking to the elements of ancientness in their own culture. And it was really this way that we started to see the spiritual and the funny and the economic and the social, all of these things mixing. And again, it keeps coming back to that idea that I'm nerding out about, which is like these quantum universes, and we're passing through them as they all unfold against each other.
And as a photographer, I was constantly trying to find these places where the sort of modern and frenetic were like mashed up against the most traditional and even sacred. These little spots, like the upper left is an intersection, but there's a reflection on a shop window with an old samurai bought a suit of armor reflecting out onto the street. Or the bottom left is a traditional shrine for children in front of a car with its car cover. So I was always looking for these places. This is a very ancient temple, thousands of years old, sitting in the middle of one of the most modern, newest financial districts in Tokyo. So if you go there as a finance guy or woman on your lunch break, you stop and you take your little paper fortune. And if it's a good fortune, you put it in your pocket and you go on your way with your good luck. And if it's a bad fortune, you tie it onto one of these strings, and then you wait for the wind to blow, and over time it slowly erodes away your bad luck. Or another place like this, not only is real estate expensive, it's an expensive place to live, it's an expensive place to be laid to rest. It's almost impossible to afford a grave in Tokyo where there is no space remaining for cemeteries. And it's also, it's inaffordable. And this Buddhist monk, found a solution. He created, again, a technology or high-tech solution for a very old problem. He created this place. The ashes of your loved ones are behind this wall of these tiny LED-lit Buddhas. You walk in with your card and swipe it, and one of the Buddhas lights up, and that's where you know your family member, your loved one's ashes are behind. And that's where you know you can go and pray.
One of the places that we found this sort of the past and the present come right to the surface was in a blue-collar neighborhood called Minami Senju, which is sort of in north central east Tokyo. It's not a neighborhood where you would think the future happens first. It's kind of gritty, a lot of little shops, and sort of like, a little bit grayer. It's not as new as the shiny Tokyo we experienced on many days. But when we were there, we were fortunate enough to bump into this Mikoshi festival. This is a Shinto festival where the local neighborhood would get together and they would go to their big Shinto shrine, and then they would unpack all of these little portable Shinto shrines. And they're called Mikoshi. And the priest would dispense a tiny portion of the local deity into each one. In this case, it was the thunder god. So then each shrine, and there were about a dozen or more of them, had a team of 40 shrine bearers, the main team, and then there were alternates. And they spent 3 days carrying these things through the city. And it's interesting here because they look like, like a party boat in a way, and there are these long wooden rails. You can see them holding on here. These things weigh as much as, I don't even know how much, they're like 1,000 pounds. That's why it takes 40 people to hold them. And the reason I know this is because this is the only point in the story where I was actually injured. Because they lift these things up onto their shoulders, and then they're like, hey, foreigner, come help. So they tap one guy out, and I'm like, what's this? It's just a shrine, I can carry it. And immediately, it's like being punched down into the ground. It was like this personal, angry thing. And the other thing that they do with these, that they don't do anywhere else I've seen in Japan, they carry them a little ways, and then they start to violently heave them back and forth, like a ship tossed at sea. And I asked what they were doing. They're like, we're shaking out good luck. We're shaking out good luck. We're refreshing the community. This is a way to bring newness and dispel evil spirits. So they would march these things through, shake them around, and this is where I got permanently injured, I think. I went home with like a C-shaped spine. And I said, what is in this thing? And the guy, the lead team guy said, our God is heavy. And this culminates at the end of 3 days with you can imagine, right? This is kind of like Mardi Gras mixed with like St. Patrick's Day with a little bit of, festivals of all kinds. You bring the shrine back to the mothership, the mother shrine, and you put it away. But before you do that, you're gonna have a huge party. And you're gonna shake the shrine more violently than the other teams. Part of this is a competition. Right, and so they're shaking it. They're trying to outdo each other. They're women-only teams. They're just throwing it around, giving commands. And here we come back to the fun. This is called a fun doshi. And we thought about wearing them for you tonight, but we decided that it was probably not a good idea. They're just, a piece of underwear with kind of like a rope that goes down in the back. And so it makes a great handle, especially if you're drunk. So that's happening here. So this guy's actually giving commands to his team. He's sort of the leader of this particular team. So you can see the shrine is already kind of like sinking like a ship. He's going to call to them and get everybody to, hurrah, lift it back up and shake it again. And this guy, actually it wasn't this guy, it was a guy in his position. He turns to me later and he just goes, our God likes it rough. And that's the takeaway from this one.
Can't believe he talked about that, but I took the photo, so.
That's a great photo of you. David got so close to this thing that there's a photo of him like all crushed like this. The shrine is about to descend onto your face, and at the last minute they pull it away and save your camera.
Neil was talking about the old and the new in all of these neighborhoods. I mean, I think that's the thing that I love and maybe respect the most about Japan. They've seemed to, as they reclaimed their city and rebuilt their city, they utilize every little inch of the capital. This is a typical neighborhood. This is a railroad bridge. On the top is the newer Shinkansen, the high-speed rail. And underneath the railroad tracks, tiny little restaurants, tiny little bars, yakitori, sushi, where people gather after work every night. They tuck away and make use of every little inch of the city. And these little restaurants and bars underneath the tracks, they just shake violently whenever the train goes overhead. People singing karaoke. I think they were singing Billy Joel, actually, in this photograph. And this is a neighborhood that just after the Second World War, during the occupation, this is the neighborhood where General MacArthur's office actually was. And so there's all these kind of layers or like sediment of history in a neighborhood like this. And underneath the railroad bridge, very near that old office, are these old movie posters, now black from the smoke of grilling yakitori and meat under the railroad tracks for so many years. And I always felt kind of like I was looking at the rings of a tree, just the sediment of all the sort of history in Japan. And not only do they reclaim every little inch of the city, but they are the greatest of recyclers in the country. How do you keep a city working? Well, how do you deal with your garbage? They have, I think it's over 20 subcategories that you have to, in your home, you have to use to divide your recycling by color of glass. Everything has to be washed, flattened. It's all very set and very organized. I learned this the hard way because when I lived there, I put the blue bottles in the bin with the green bottles. And I had to go door to door to every apartment in my building and apologize and bow deeply for this. Living there, then I was younger. There were times where I thought there were maybe a little bit too many rules. But coming back, after I moved to the United States after living there for 9 years, and I've been here now for a little over 3. My country, I feel a little bit like a stranger in my own country right now, and our country doesn't feel that familiar, and it doesn't feel that civil at the moment. So when I went back to Japan, all those little rules and all the things that maybe I found a little bit difficult when I lived there when I was younger, I discovered the things that I love most about Japan and what I respect most about the Japanese, because these are big, beefy construction workers. They gather every morning to have a group meeting before they get down underground to start building the new subway line. They put this old school kind of boom box and they play this light music and they all do group calisthenics together. And I just feel like this is a place where people stick together, where people, when National Geographic asked us how does Tokyo work, we could talk about the trains and we could talk about how they are fed, and we could talk about all the superlatives that Neil mentioned, but what works for Tokyo is that these 37 million people want it to work, and they look after each other, and they cooperate, and it's a place of civility, and that's something that I was really hungry to go back to coming from the United States right now.
I think what this story taught both of us, and certainly I've been thinking about this for a long time now, is that cities show us so much about human behavior. Obviously, we talk a lot about the bad stuff that they show us, but they also show us the incredible nature of the human condition, which is to continue to invent problems and then try to solve them. And Tokyo is very good at this. The city is both the problem and the answer to the problem. It is the question and the answer to the question all at once. And I started to think of Tokyo as what is a city but really like desire given form. We want a certain kind of life. We want to get to work speedily and safely. We want to have a healthy economy. We want these things. And so Tokyo became for me, in a way, it's a real place, but it's also an imaginary city. And one of the things that the Japanese residents of the Tokyo residents seem to share is that they're constantly imagining their city and reimagining their city. They're imagining how they want it to be, and they're imagining what they want it to look years from now. This isn't happening necessarily consciously, but they're all agreeing to imagine together what this city is going to be, what the country is going to be. And they're making this social contract with each other that they're going to do it. Whatever form it takes, whatever the difficulty is to get there, we're going to do it. And we're going to do it together. And I think that's one of the most unique things about Tokyo, is that it's a stride time, it's an imaginary city, but it's held together by this social contract that is unique to Japan, and that everybody is driving toward the same thing. They don't know what it is, but they're all on the ride together.
So the last thing that I want to show you, as I said, we walked through the city with our phones, and I shot a lot of stuff that would normally land on the cutting room floor, but our editors said, wow, you brought back a lot. And we stitched this little group of videos together that I made on my phone, because I think it's a chance to kind of see, get into Neil or my head, what it's like to be out there as a National Geographic writer or photographer, but also it's a way to kind of feel like you're walking through the city also and having those serendipitous moments and discovering the city on the walk in the way that we did. Thank you very much.